Excellent. So it looks like everything's going. I hope everybody's had a wonderful week. And I'll jump right into it. For anybody who's just joining us, as per usual, raise your hand when we get to public comments in about 15 minutes. We will invite you up to give your 1-minute testimony. Until then, let's jump into a review of the agenda. So the main points on this agenda are to confirm the handcuffing, control holds, and impact weapons policy, policy 808, and take a look at our civil disturbance policy. Yearly appropriately timed, given the events of the past week. Does anybody have any changes or amendments to the existing agenda? Seeing none, let's jump in to liaison reports. Macy, do you want to, oh, we have Silvery now as well. Do you want to give the reports from the ad hoc committee?
Who were you speaking to?
You and Macy. I'll let you choose between the two of you.
I have a question. Do you need to move to approve the agenda?
Yeah, we can. I was just taking it as unanimous consent unless somebody has something they want to change to it.
I move that we accept the agenda.
Sweet. Second? Silver, any objections? Everybody in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right. With that, yeah, let's move on to the liaison report.
So last night's subcommittee on, what day is it? Subcommittee on use of force was very, what's the word when you get stuff done? I don't even know anymore. Productive. We got a lot of stuff done. And we actually went through a number of different motions that we're going to present to the committee as a whole. And the conversation at the committee level has, could take some pointers on how to be productive from our subcommittee, I would say. It was good having a conversation with the chief. He was there. And so that was some good access that we had last night. Kind of get some clarifying points. And the next ad hoc committee will be meeting on the 20th at 6 o'clock.
Excellent. Thanks. Macy, do you have anything to add?
That sums it up pretty well. Thanks, Silver.
Thank you. All right, Lindsay, for the Civilian Review Board.
Thanks, Sean. So the Civilian Review Board just finished on Tuesday, sort of the final steps of wrapping up the community impact case that was open in response to the protests back on May 29th, 30th, and 31st. So we met in December to review those cases, and then we met again last night to sort of wrap up that process. I'll just describe it a little bit. Some of it is pertinent to the discussions that we're going to have tonight, so I'll try to make sure to highlight those things so it's useful for the conversation. But basically, there's a massive amount of work that the auditor's office put in, and that IA and the additional kind of people who were pulled in to help reviewing these cases. So we looked at specific allegations of misconduct, but the other thing that was very helpful was kind of doing whole night sort of overviews, because there's a lot of context that goes into evaluating specific allegations of misconduct when you're talking about the kind of level of chaos that was going on. And so that was actually also really helpful for me to see. Things on Sunday night were very different than Friday night. And so you could see just through the videos that we were watching and other things, how the situation on the ground around officers was very different, but also officers' response was more coordinated. You could see that there was some sort of learning that had happened and improvements that had been made from Friday to Sunday. So that was good to see and to be able to watch. So I will start by saying that I think the investigations were incredibly thorough. They were very well documented, clear, easy to understand. I think there was over 600 hours of video footage that was captured over the course of these 3 nights. And we also received civilian footage from various sources, right? Like live streamed videos or cell phone videos that people had supplemented. I did not review 600 hours of footage. It was probably closer to like 125 hours of footage that that we viewed for these cases. But it was really well done. And I should give a shout out to Sergeant Barrett and Sergeant Nelson. Also did some additional work for us in creating some overview videos with like maps and descriptions of kind of what had happened so that we could contextualize all the specific incidents we were looking at. That's just kind of above and beyond what I would even expect, but was really, really helpful in aiding in the transparency of what we were trying to do. So we ended up looking at a handful of allegations of misconduct, a few inquiries, which were basically like, we would like to know more, but we don't know if there's allegations of misconduct that will come out of it. In several cases, there wasn't anything that went beyond sort of the inquiry of let's look at some video, let's talk to some people, let's see what there is. So there were several of those. And the process is, with the community impact case, is a little tiny bit different than all the other cases the CRB reviews, where this the chief gives his initial adjudications, the auditor gives their initial adjudications, and then the CRB reviews the cases and sort of weighs in before the chief's final adjudication. Doesn't actually change the outcome in terms of the chief being the final decider on the adjudication, but it does give the CRB an opportunity to have a voice if they disagreed with the chief's initial adjudications. And there were several allegations of misconduct where the majority of the CRB agreed with, did not agree with the chief's recommended adjudications. In some cases, didn't agree with the auditor's recommended adjudications. And I'd be happy to go over those like more specifically if you want, but I'm just trying to kind of give you an overview of what happened. So we've wrapped up the review, made our sort of public votes about what we think about the adjudications. The chair of the Civilian Review Board, Carolyn Williams, sent chief a letter with all the findings sort of summarized to the chief. And let's see, where are we now? Oh, and then we did not want to reopen any of the investigations. So that's the other thing that can happen. If the CRB wants to ask the auditor to reopen anything in a community impact case, we feel that there was insufficient investigation or something, we can ask that they do that. We did not ask that they do that on any of the cases that we saw. There were 2 specific incidents that I witnessed when I was viewing video that I had questions about, not necessarily concerns, but just questions. I brought them up in the December meeting, and the auditor and IA followed up, did some supplemental investigation and returned the information to me and the rest of the CRB, and I'm very satisfied with that process. So when I felt like I did want more information was given to us, was made available. And so that's where we are. There was some discussions in the meeting on Tuesday. Some members of the CRB felt that the timeline that is prescribed in the ordinance for these community impact cases was challenging because of the volume of video that there was to review. It was extraordinarily challenging to meet the 14-day timeline. And of course, when the ordinance was written, there wasn't body cam footage. There's a lot of things. So we thought it wasn't totally dysfunctional. I think we felt like it was a pretty functional process, but there were some things that were challenging, particularly when it came to timing. And the last thing I'll draw your attention to is I asked Jeremy to forward Deputy Auditor Pitcher's memo that she sent to Chief December 3rd, and I saw that it circulated. Basically, this has policy recommendations that are related to the 40 millimeter long-range impact weapon that we'll be discussing as part of the conversation tonight. And I just wanted her policy recommendations to be included in the record so that we could consider them if that seems appropriate, or discuss them, because I thought they were, you know, based on witnessing sort of some specific incidents, and that they're well thought out and a good place to start a conversation. So I'm happy to answer any and all questions. It was a gigantic undertaking, and I'm quite sure there are details you might be interested in that I haven't given you, but if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
I would like to avoid digging into the soup of detail on the incidents, but I think one of the things that would help our work very much is if there's any instances where policy proved insufficient, when you saw something happen that shouldn't have, but wasn't technically against policy, or anything like that.
I mean, there were some things like, so in this moment, I'm going to speak on behalf of myself, not the CRB.
Mm-hmm.
So on behalf of myself, there were some incidents where, because of the gear that officers were wearing that they don't typically wear in an ordinary work day, their body cams were occluded, which was a bummer. There were several incidents, like whether they were wearing a certain kind of vest, or whether they were carrying a certain kind of like a pepper ball gun or something that had a strap that happened to hit across the body worn camera. There were some things like that. It still captured really great audio. So there was still, and it wasn't usually like every single officer in an incident that had their camera occluded, but that seemed like something that we should think about. I also had concerns about officers who get called out directly from home to respond to scenes, because if they don't stop by headquarters first, they don't have body cams, and that's a problem for me. SWAT was not wearing body cams, which is a problem for me. So I think thinking about, you know, do certain teams who routinely get called out from home need to have body cams of, you know, like at home that they can bring in, like whether that would be K9 team or SWAT team, those would be the two teams I could think of that probably routinely get called out from home. I know that's expensive and that's not a small ask, right? It needs to be charged and it needs to be backed up, and that requires a charging station, and that is money. So I'm not making light of that, but I think it's something to think about. I really don't, I'm looking forward to the conversations that we have about the 40 millimeter being used as a crowd dispersal. Watching how CS gas was used was an interesting and new thing for me. And how often the canisters of CS gas would get tossed back at officers was a little bit surprising to me. I didn't, you know, have any kind of personal experience with any of this to sort of frame what I was witnessing, but those were sort of initial concerns. And we're talking about one of the policies tonight, so I'm glad about that. And yeah,
I'm hoping you can bring the rest of the details you talked about into those discussions where relevant. With that, I'd like to move on to public comments. If we have anybody who is in the public who'd like to leave a public comment, please raise your hand. It does not, I don't see any unfamiliar names in the attendees list. I'm assuming we will move directly on into commissioner comments from there. I'll go first this time, and then Macy. My comment is twofold. I am very concerned, as many people are, about the attack on our nation's capital. Very worried about if any EPD officers might have gotten caught up in the incidents. And I'm very curious about our process with, you know, both respect to employees' rights to spend their weekend at what they might have thought was a peaceful protest, no matter how much I personally disagree with the cause, and the very real acts of treason and terrorism that occurred, and what EPD's process is going to look like investigating these potential crimes. a little bit more recently, the declaration of unlawful assembly at our Eugene's federal courthouse. I saw a live stream. I saw the declaration, and I saw the apparent obedience of the crowd, and I saw the police withdraw, and I saw the crowd then emboldened by the withdrawal. So I suspect this is something we'll be talking about when we talk about civil disturbances, but I want to call particular light to those in my comments. Macy and then Dallas.
Hello, good to see everyone. I have written up a statement that I would like to read. So here I go. Thank you all for being here. It is good to see all of you. As you know, the recent attacks on our nation's capital put America's underbelly on public display. With that being said, Black and brown people of color have been aware of the grotesque side of America since before the land was stolen from the indigenous people. The hate that this country was founded on has shown itself in Oregon from sundown laws to Eugene being the prime breeding ground for the Ku Klux Klan recruitment to the assault of Black and brown bodies. It is no surprise that these racist ideologies have infiltrated the police force. It is a way to hide in plain sight, to act as savior and overseer, to hear members of EPD repeatedly claim that it does not happen here, which is racism, is an affront to every single Black and brown person that lives here. Just because racism looks different here does not mean that it does not happen here. In fact, the insidiousness of this thought process is one that allows for the savior and overseer mentality to succeed. I would implore you to resist that complacent mindset that ravages throughout our society, especially in this liberal bubble of Eugene. Instead, examine the role you play in upholding these narratives and dismantle them within yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Macy. Dallas and then Ian.
Thank you. My message is real simple, just with what's going on lately. I just want to make sure that the police stay aware, stay prepared, and prosecute. No excuses. That's it.
Thanks, Dallas. Ian and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Macy for his statement. And yeah, I was just totally appalled by the blatant white supremacy from the insurrection at the US Capitol, and feel that our work is just as important as it previously was. And to be able to look at the policies in front of us tonight, particularly 317 civil disturbances through a new lens, knowing that this is part of our reality in Oregon. And yeah, just wanted to underscore what Maisie said. Just because that happened at the US Capitol doesn't mean it couldn't happen at the state capitol, and doesn't mean it can't happen in Eugene. And to be able to support policy that allows for legitimate civil disobedience, while at the same time empowers our officers to be able to dismantle protest, which is violent and inherently racist, meant to threaten folks from being able to express themselves in the constitutional way, which we all should be able to. So with that, I just wanted to say thanks again, Macy, for the work, for your statement, and really appreciate Lindsay, I can't even imagine seemingly infinite pots of coffee that got you through 125 hours of video.
Thanks, Ian. Jennifer and then Chantel.
Thank you. And also thank you, Macy. That was a very powerful thing you said, and I appreciate you being willing to say it tonight. I am reminded about how thankful I am to have all of you here, to be doing this work together with us. We obviously need a lot of help, and I trust all of you, and I'm so glad we have this group. And on that note, Sean and V did an excellent job presenting our work plan and answering some questions at council. Some of them not easy questions, and I thought you did a really good job of articulating what this group is going to try to do, especially in this environment we found ourselves in, when this work is especially important, and also a lot of eyes on it. So I want to thank you too for what you did at the presentation.
Thanks, Jennifer. Chantel and then Silver.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, Macy. I thought what you said was really powerful as well. My comment's kind of short and sweet. You know, safety is my #1 goal for my community and my family. And lately, I don't feel safe in my community. You know, with what happened downtown too, in kind of result of the Capitol, I was getting messages saying, stay home, don't go here, don't go here. And I thought, in my own community. And so I also too wonder, you know, what the EPD are doing about that, and the fear around our children, and the fear around just going to common places that we go every day. So again, thank you for all of you for being here, and I hope things get better.
Thank you, Chantel. Silver and then Lindsay.
So I'd like to say that I was surprised by the actions and by the consequences and the reactions to what took place January 6th, but I am not. And I'd like to say that I was sickened by the, it seems as though there's an attitude when it's a right-wing protest that it's the attitude of boys will be boys. This is just the way they're going to behave, and we'll be sort of hands off. And when it was Black Lives Matter, there were numerous police officers and different LEOs that were there looking at the situation. And I am not surprised by that. And I would say that I was not surprised to hear that there is possible working together with elected officials and different high ups. That doesn't surprise me. And on the weekend and around the inauguration, I won't be surprised when it does happen again, since there were light to little consequences at this point. This has been a trying time, and I look forward to some of the work that we're able to do here for our own community. And I do want to remember that the officer was bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher. And my heart goes out to him and to his family. And I believe there was another officer who was involved with sustained some major injuries. And I cannot imagine that took place. And so I do want to take the time out to recognize that there were several people hurt, and that includes law enforcement officers who were there to try to keep something like that from happening.
Lindsay and then V.
I don't have anything significant to add. Thank you, Macy. Thank you, Silver, for your comments. And thank you all for being here tonight.
V and then Bonnie.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add, but I would say that this is a very tragic time for our nation and for our people. And I think that, the hopeful part of me is that we have reached rock bottom, and there's only one way to go, and that's up. And I want to believe that. I think one thing that we have to have is just hope. It's just hope that, that the inauguration would go smoothly. Our law enforcement, including the FBI and Secret Service, are able to do their job without a whole lot of unpredictable elements, and that way we can, move on to a future that, hopefully will bring peace and stability for us. Other than that, really appreciate everyone's comments. I also appreciate Maisie's comment as well. It really echoes how I feel, as a person of color. So thank you.
Thanks, V. Bonnie, if you're able to join us, I know you might have personal things that occlude that. Cool. Can hear you. You're kind of light, but we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. I just pretty much would like to echo Silver and also add, but I'm not sure if I'm actually adding to anything because I've been having technical difficulties. Pretty much my understanding is that what happened at the Capitol, my understanding is that they were warned about what was going on. It was pretty obvious in social media. They had a lot of people telling them that this was happening, and they were not prepared because they didn't prepare, but they could. And as I mentioned a while back, I guess I just wonder what the state of Eugene is, where previously we had discussed with Officer Naivasha about how prepared the city of Eugene is with that kind of thing. So I guess I'd love to hear more about how that's going. That's all.
Thanks, Bonnie. Alan, I'm assuming you're still busy, so we will move on. Not saying an unmute. So I will move on to Chief's report. Chief Skinner, if you are able, there we go. You're still muted, but.
Yeah, it's always nice to, before my Chief's report, to have you guys give comments, because pretty much I don't have to come prepared for anything, and you guys have your comments, and now I know what I'm supposed to say. So I appreciate that. And I'll have some other comments as well. It's been a long 8 months. There's no question. I want to first and foremost extend some gratitude to the CRB for kind of tackling the community impact case. We had a couple of different individuals in our department that were pouring over 600 hours of body cam footage, looking for instances that we needed to pay attention to, and not sitting back and waiting for other people to point out our faults, but for us to go through 600 hours and find our own faults and then bring those. So some of those instances that went to the CRB were obvious things that people experienced, but in at least a couple of cases, those are things that we were able to identify internally. And I think that's a sign of a healthy organization that has a healthy rate of internal complaints and doesn't just sit back and wait for the community to quote unquote catch them doing something wrong or experience disparate treatment, that we actually try to create a culture where it's expected. It speaks to the duty to intercede language we're talking about. There's a strong culture of expectation around us interceding and identifying where we could have done better and bringing that to our attention. So I appreciate the CRB and the work they did, and I appreciate the work that was done internally, because one individual in particular, her name is Lisa Magnus, her whole job as our quality assurance specialist, that's all she did every single day for weeks and weeks and weeks, is look at body cam video, seeing if there's some things that we needed to be aware of. So I appreciate that work, and she's still going through that. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is you've seen some communication from me, whether it's written or media or print, about being prepared for this next week. I'm acutely aware of the tension and the sensitivity that this community is feeling for a variety of reasons. You know, I will never fully understand or be able to appreciate where how people of color are feeling, because I have not had those experiences, and I want to just say that into existence, that I'm learning and I'm growing through this process, and I think our department is trying to learn and grow as well. But when it comes to community safety, I take that really serious, and we are doing everything we possibly can to prepare for what we may see, if anything, here in Eugene. The tough part is our last visualization of kind of how this could happen on a big scale is what happened on January 6th at the nation's capital. If the question is if I'm prepared for something like that, there's no organization in the state that's prepared for something of that magnitude, quite frankly. But we are prepared for what we typically see in Eugene around sizes and gatherings and the types of behavior. We will be prepared, and we are prepared to be able to respond to that appropriately. Oftentimes those preparations are not seen to the general public. Oftentimes our level of presence and the magnitude by which we can respond with human bodies, with with human capital, is not seen to the community. But rest assured, we are building plans to have people available to be able to respond if we need to, and we're, like most agencies, trying to do a really good job of letting the intelligence and our investigators speak to and build our response plan. And so that is stuff we're doing here locally, that's stuff we're doing statewide, things that we're doing with our federal partners around what the intelligence is telling us. And there's some tricks of the trade that I won't share in a public platform, but certainly rest assured we are engaged in areas that we're able to get that good information to best prepare us for what we potentially would see next week. I can assure you that as of this morning, and it changes daily, hourly, that there is nothing that is specifically planned for our area. The reason I say that is because there has not been, with the exception of May 29th, there has not been a protest or a gathering that we haven't known about, at least at some level. We may have prepared differently for them, but we've always known about what's going on. And just to put it in context, as you're talking about crowd control and unlawful gatherings and 40 millimeter and impact munitions and gas and all the stuff that goes along with that, we have just ellipsed, I think this last weekend, we just ellipsed our 100th protest that we've managed and tried to keep track of. In the early days is where you saw most of the munitions and some of the overt tactics being used. We've used gas 4 times out of 100 different protests, and have not used the 40 millimeter specifically since those first few days of the protest. And so we've learned, we've grown, we've learned how to do this better. And you've heard me say before, that it's good news that you're not so good at this. That means you don't have it a lot, but after 100 of these, we're actually getting better and we're learning. We're prepared, and we'll be watching, and we'll hope for a smooth week next week. I'm not sure. People know what my expectation is. I've been very, very vocal about what my expectation is, whether they take that to heart or not, to the point where I've probably, somebody mentioned to me the other day that, I may be poking the bear a little bit with some of my dialogue, but that's okay, because guess what? I sleep just fine at night. One of the things that I would note is there's some things that continually happen within the organization as a result of good counsel by not only the police commission, but out of the CRB and in our auditor's office. I've been working really closely with Leah on a lot of these things. And one of those things that will probably be interesting for this group to know about tonight's conversation about the 40 millimeter is a command directive that's already in place around the suspension of the 40 millimeter impact weapon to be used in certain aspects. And I can share that language with you. But there are instances where I, as your chief, as we're having dialogue or as we're waiting for the process to maybe formally go through these processes around policies, I feel fairly strongly that I need to just issue a command directive so we immediately can adjust what we're doing. I've done that in a couple of different instances, and the most recent one is around the 40 millimeter after some real deficiencies were identified through the community impact case and how that was deployed, and some lack of clarity in policy, and I think some lack of clarity in training that contributed to the use of that, maybe the unjustified use of that on those particular nights. So we continue to try and be mindful of those things. Lastly, I will just trying to answer some of the other questions that were made. I was asked, I've been asked this a few times. I have no knowledge of anybody that participated in the the protest at the Capitol on January 6th. Certainly with as many employees as we have, their private travel is kept private, but what you'll find is that in almost every case of people being held accountable for being there, it's been as the result of someone tells someone or their social media. It's how we solve crime, quite frankly. It's just nobody can keep their mouth shut about what they do. And in these cases, you trust that nobody can keep their mouth shut about what they do. And so we eventually find out, but there has been nothing on my radar screen at all that would suggest that an EPD member was back in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And as always, speaking to Maisie's statement, we certainly do the very, very best we can on the front end to hire the right people of good moral and ethical character to do this job. But I'm not so naive as to believe when you have 350 employees, 200 of them are police officers, that each one of them are going to have different value system, different ideology, and we definitely try to identify and uncover that before we make those good hiring decisions. You have been exposed to the extensiveness of our background investigations and to the lengths that we go, in a psychological evaluation for our police officers and other staff members, dispatchers. The missing piece in all of it that I've been exposed to in the past is the polygraph, and if you've never been through a polygraph, it's not anything I would wish on even my worst of enemies. It's demoralizing. You have to admit everything you've ever done in your life. But it is a selection tool in Washington State for our law enforcement professionals. Certainly not an exact science, but is a layer that is missing in Oregon that potentially could be something that we try to put in place in an effort to select the best human beings possible to wear the uniform. Yeah, my continued commitment to be focused on moral character and the character and the heart of the human being we're hiring. And that will, as long as I'm here, that will be kind of the cornerstone of how we hire. Teach them how to be police officers. Second, hire good human beings first. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. I would love to open it up for questions, but I know we're going to have a bunch to talk about with the next upcoming policies. So I'm going to jump right into the handcuffing, control holds, and impact weapons. And if there are other questions, you'll probably see them show up in your inbox here shortly. Yeah, so we took the initial look at these a couple months ago. Policy 808, it looks like those changes have been incorporated. Is that something you are prepared to speak on, Sergeant Nelson?
Yeah, so I didn't have this. You're catching the transition period here.
Yep.
So Sergeant Williams actually completed those. I did look at them. I also had asked Sergeant Maloney, who's the defensive tactics supervisor, who I think you guys have spoke to before. He is available for conversations or any questions that people might have. I recalled, and again, I think it was like my first meeting when you started this, and so I was kind of trying to figure out how all this worked. But what I recalled was some discussion around definitions of the passive resistance, active resistance. And so he's here to be able to talk to if anybody's interested in doing that. And then there was also some discussions around specific control holds. So I'm happy to have him chat with people if that's something you're interested in.
I know that I didn't see anything that jumped out at me, but I know I liked seeing the correction of the gendered language. I saw Silver's inclusion. Does anybody have any comments on the commission or follow-up questions that they would like to run through?
Wait, sorry, you said that you can when can you discuss the different control holds? Or actually, wait, I was thinking about pay compliance. Is that what we're talking about? I'm so sorry. I'm having.
We're discussing policy 808, which is the three different policies that we discussed back in November, I believe, in our November meeting. So yeah, control hold.
Previously, I had questions about, there was something in the language where it was very unspecific, and we had talked about how EPD.
The application of pain compliance techniques. Is that what you're thinking of?
Yes, and then like what goes in and out of fashion. I think those were his words at the time, and I wanted more clarification about that. Did you have follow-up on that by chance? Because before he was saying that maybe we could just rely where it is that happens at the training academy.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so to summarize what I remember from last time, and correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, but the term pain compliance is really broad and unspecific. Some of the reasons for that were that the variety of techniques changed up at the state level. The training for them changed up at the state level. But with Sergeant Maloney here, this might be the perfect time to hear a little bit more about what sort of pain compliance techniques are currently in use and any difficulties or ways we can make it a little bit clearer in the policy so that citizens can understand what that means.
That's the gist of it. Thank you.
So, hello everyone. Sorry, I don't mean to kind of jump in here a little bit.
No,
so,
please.
Bonnie, I'm trying to kind of get exactly what your question is as far as what you're wanting to know about different pain compliance techniques or what we do at EPD. Are you wanting to know the actual techniques, or are you talking about situational stuff for officers during arrest? What exactly is your question, I guess?
Okay. How about come back to me? I'm gonna find specifically where the words are. I'm really sorry.
No,
so
it's just before 808.4. The exact wording is the application of any pain compliance technique will be discontinued once the officer, that's the final line of it, determines that compliance has been achieved, but it never actually lists what pain compliance techniques we use.
Thank you.
Hey, Ryan, why don't you go through just a couple of examples of what that might look like when affecting an arrest or trying to gain control of somebody?
Okay, so to kind of give a little bit of an example of, you've got different levels of resistance that people offer when it comes to making a lawful arrest. Some people, there's no resistance. Some people, there's a lot of resistance. The pain compliance techniques that we use, for one example, a lot of them are pressure point based. So pressure points that when pushed on and applied pressure to create a disturbance basically in their body, and it distracts them from resisting whatever they're doing at the time to stop that action from occurring. It's not, the pain compliance techniques aren't intrusive enough to cause bruising. They're not intrusive enough to cause long-term pain or disability or anything like that. They're just simply kind of a way to get them out of the OODA loop cycle that they're in. And if they're trying to resist by not giving us their arm or not putting their hands behind their back or starting to physically resist more like that, a pain compliance applied by another officer that's there to distract them from what they're doing so we can place handcuffs on them has been very effective in the aspect of it allows us not to use a higher level of force and allows us to not injure people as well as not have officers injured in an escalated use of force that just didn't need to happen.
I guess it would be really nice to have specifics just to know like what they are. And I think that's kind of what I had been asking last time was like, what are they specifically? Like the pressure points, I kind of get that, but I guess I wonder just like, well, if you're getting a pressure point near the neck, like that seems a little dangerous. And actually when we discussed it last time, I hurt myself on video or on camera or whatever, because I was pressing a pressure point and that actually hurt for a couple days. But anyway, beside the point, I guess it would be really nice to have that outline because they seem to change. And if they're changing, I feel like that kind of takes away accountability of what it is that we're doing to people. Well, not me, what you're doing to people. Does that make sense? So I would just love to have more specifics. And I think that it shouldn't be something that we don't really know about. And I think it would be nice to have it in words. And I don't think that it would be too much of an issue to just update the policy. I mean, it's just text, right? And you just change it and say, now we're using this technique because the last one just went out of fashion, I think.
Right, and so to answer that as precise as I can, Bonnie, the techniques that we use as far as the pressure point techniques for pain compliance, those really haven't changed a whole lot because they're a low level of force and they don't cause damage to people, like the nerve right below the ear at the top of the neck by just poking on it behind the jaw. By pushing on it, you feel that. The collarbone, by pushing in there, it doesn't affect airway, it doesn't affect blood flow, it doesn't affect anything except actual nerve clusters in those areas. And so we have those techniques that we use, that we train people on. Adding that verbiage to the policy is, I don't want to say unnecessary, but what it is that you have access to all that information with our training documents, and you can see that, and I can give you that list. But to add that verbiage, you also have to understand that if it doesn't work, or if it misses, or if the level of force raises up to a totality of circumstances to a higher level of force, just because we train something in particular doesn't mean that we're stuck at only using those techniques that we train in order to make a lawful arrest based on the totality of circumstances. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think we can.
Yes, and I would love to have it.
Sorry, we missed the last thing you said, Bonnie.
Oh, sorry. Yes, and I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that that was in something that was more accessible, the training policy. So apologies, and I will look into it.
I did not find it when I looked online. I didn't search super hard. I do think it's an excellent resource for the community. And I've got Lindsay up next. If anybody else has stuff afterwards, just raise your hand.
So yeah, knowing where to find that, if that's something that's public available, would be super helpful. If not, if it's something, sometimes it's hard to dig through the website, I'll just be honest. I have a love-hate relationship with the Palm as it is on the website because I need light nighttime reading. But Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind maybe helping and just distributing that, because I would love to see it too. And that would really help me not have to try to dig around and find the training manual. If that's available to us, then that would be awesome. And I'd love to see it just in the email. My question had to do with, we talked about this a little bit last time, and I would love to get a little more clarification about the difference between passive and static resistance. Active resistance, I understand. Passive and static resistance, like what the distinctions between those two things seems like. If there's a distinction, fine. If it's not a clear distinction, then it seems like unnecessary language. So I'd love to hear more about how you train to recognize passive versus static resistance and the use of pain compliance techniques in those situations.
Okay, so you're right to assume that the passive and static are they're so closely related that it's just a little bit of the history behind some of that is that back when the use of force continuum was made, the term static and passive, those were used in that continuum as a way to differentiate what levels of force and what tools can be used and what kind of pain compliance can be used and that kind of stuff based on a lawful arrest. So that's where that kind of came from. And so the difference between passive and static is very minimal. It really is. So the passive resistance, like as you can look up online, you can do different things. I'm sure you guys have. It's a nonviolent, just passive way of refusing a lawful order or authority, depending on what the legal parameters are for officers. The way we explain it to our officers is that's that passive resistance is nonviolent toward them. The static resistive is still nonviolent, but what it does is it bumps things up to a point of where it used to be like the old protests where people would chain themselves together, or they would chain themselves to an object. They're still not violent and they're still passive, but they're attached to a physical object or each other, which means they're static, and we can't just remove them without some level of pain compliance or force or something like that. And then obviously the active resistance bumps up to they're actively resisting that lawful order.
Thank you, that's helpful. I think my sensitivity is having, not as, just to be super clear, not as part of my work on the CRB, and fully recognizing that in the last 20 years, a lot of things have changed, but watching old video of, let's say, maybe people who are trying to prevent logging or something, who are chained together, having like pepper spray directly applied to their eyelids, like things like that, which were definitely like a pain compliance technique, but against, which seemed to be sort of punitive in nature as opposed to trying to gain compliance. It really just seemed like it was causing suffering. So I'm sensitive with those images in my mind that I don't want pain compliance to be used as a punitive measure against someone who is, peacefully protesting, let's say. But that's not what you're describing. But when I read the language, I can't, I'm still like having like a little bit of a challenge with the idea of using pain compliance in a case of passive resistance. So I don't know, it's just a comment, I guess, more than anything. If you want to comment, you can. You don't have to. It's just something I'm thinking about.
Yeah, no, I definitely can empathize with that. I've seen a lot of those videos. I've been to a lot of those different trainings. I've talked to people that are directly involved, and especially those logging ones, where different devices like tripods were set up, sleeping dragons were set up, different things like that, and climbing into trees, training themselves inside trees, and that kind of stuff. That's pretty common around here as far as what we've seen in the past. The evolution of how we approach those things has definitely changed. The way we approached them prior to me working here, I've been here for almost 17 years. We haven't addressed those like that. They learned from a lot of mistakes in the past, so to speak. And so we've continued to evolve on that, like we're evolving now with different field force things. The pain compliance is directly, and I do a lot of the training. I do all the training, especially when it comes to the policy stuff with all of our new officers and our ongoing annual training and in service and that kind of stuff. And I make it abundantly clear. And I mean, case law supports it as well. Just the fact that just being a good person supports it. And any sort of punitive action towards somebody because you're either irritated or you're upset with something, or you personally have a biased opinion on what's going on is unacceptable in our field, because that's not what we're there to do. Those techniques are taught for lawful orders only, and when we have a lawful opportunity to do that, then we do. And the reason the pain compliance things are utilized a lot of times is so that we don't injure people or cause substantial injury or to people for really a low governmental interest in what's going on.
So I have a suggestion that might satisfy both Bonnie's concerns and the necessity of keeping the policy flexible enough to use state-approved pain compliance techniques without, adding a bunch of pages. And that is before, if you'll see at 808.4, just the first sentence just before that section, we've added the prohibition against choke and strangleholds. We added another sentence just above that saying pain compliance techniques will not be used in a punitive fashion. Will never be used in a punitive fashion. We might be able to address those concerns. Bonnie, since this is largely generated from your comment, what do you think about that?
Kind of seems, I mean, I like it, but it's kind of vague, I think. Give me a second, I'm still thinking, but I guess, for example, that, sorry, I cut, but it sounded like Lindsay was saying that a lot of people were chained together and then they were pepper sprayed or something. Is that correct?
I'm not talking specifically about anything recent. I was just saying, I was giving an example of what I thought was a punitive use of pain as opposed to pain compliance to, like, for example, more safely affect an arrest. And so I think that for me, not necessarily saying this is for you, but for me, I think that the infliction of pain for the sake of it being punitive was my concern. But I don't want to speak for you. I'm not sure, anyway.
Well, and just to clarify a little bit, sorry to jump in, I forgot to clarify. You used a good example, but I just want to clarify that we don't train or use pepper spray in any punitive or for pain compliance at all. That's not a pain compliance technique. That's an actual non-lethal force option on a higher level of force.
Thank you so much for clarifying. Yeah, thank you.
Well, you think about that, Bonnie. I saw V's hand.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. So, Sergeant Maloney, I know that, punitive, non-punitive is really hard to even, prove, right? I mean, how do you determine if an officer's doing pain compliance, to the extent that is punitive or not? I know that, one of the technique is by manipulating the pinky, the last digit on your hand, twisting it in a way that, somebody can then say it's painful. But what if you have an arrestee or suspect who is intoxicated, with narcotics, that basically gives them higher pain tolerance, then what do you do? What is the protocol then? Do they get their finger twisted to the point that it snaps, or, is there something else that takes place when that's determined, that they no longer, that pain compliance is not applicable to their, status?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Really, the answer to that is that what we train people to do and what we train all of our officers to do is that if you use some sort of pain compliance as a force option, if it's not effective, the definition of insanity, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, you'll go insane. It's that theory of if it's not effective, then it's expected to be stopped immediately, and then a new option is to be exercised. So in the situation you're talking about, we deal with that a lot, actually, especially on Friday, Saturday nights, that kind of stuff, around downtown area, that kind of stuff. and Dewey drivers that end up resisting. The majority of our resisting arrest things come out of the multiple times that we go into handcuffing. So once people hear the handcuffs come out, that kind of stuff, that's when people decide to sometimes change their mind. And that seems to be a turning point. And so being a high level of intoxication is something we deal with on a regular basis. So if those pain compliances don't work and they're continuing to resist, that's really, you kind of go a different route. So whether that be a joint lock or an armbar takedown or something, so that you can restrain this person so that other officers can assist in getting him into handcuffs, he or she, or whoever is being arrested, can do so in a safe manner without actually inflicting more injury, or needless injury, I should say, on the subject that we just didn't need to have.
I appreciate that information. Thank you.
I've got Dallas next.
Just a quick question. How much training is done on this pain compliance?
Well, our basic academy classes are pre-academy. We put them through, I think it's 60 hours of training currently. Out of the pain compliance specifically, we spend at least 6 hours on it. And then it's revisited when it comes to scenario-based training, another 10 hours of that, 10 to 20 hours of that in our training. Then they go to the DPS S&T of the academy, and they have another set curriculum where they'll go over a lot of the same things and they'll address it there. Then we have ongoing in-service training. At least once a year, we address these topics and the different situations where we have resistive suspects that we need to take into custody and need to restrain into handcuffs. And we go over everything from joint locks to pressure points to pain compliance, so that we can do that in the least violent way possible.
So would you say that that's enough training?
You know, you're talking to a trainer, so I would say there's never enough. And so we're constantly growing, and we're constantly requesting more training, and we're getting it. It's not to say that we have enough, but I will say that the amount of use of force training that the state of Oregon requires per officer is about 8 hours a year. That's their requirement for the certification. We give a year well over 30 per officer, and if you're a new recruit, then you'll get right around 80.
And it's ongoing.
Yeah, we always have ongoing in-service training and annual. And so defensive tactics alone has, out of the 8 months a year that we do in-service training, we're involved with at least 6 months of that, like 6 actual days in that training.
So the second part of my question is, how does that stack up to de-escalating training?
So that's a whole nother topic. And so that de-escalation is definitely incorporated into all of our scenario-based training, and is a separate training that we work through, and a separate policy that we train and work through.
But how many hours are they doing that in the academy versus the pain compliance?
Well, every single scenario that we have built in, we've adjusted. So over the last couple of years, so every single scenario-based training we have a performance objective for de-escalation and a requirement for communication, opening communication, and the debriefing with the officer will require them to be able to give us information back as to what the subject they were talking to even said, to make sure that there's dialogue going on, that they're paying attention, that they're working on active listening, as well as, you know, working toward their officer safety as to figure out how to resolve the situation.
Because something just tells me that the more of the second part, the de-escalating training, and the more we tackle that through training, through what you get as far as footage and so forth, will reflect on not having to do so much of the pain compliance. Because I'm pretty sure that that's going to be a hard thing to kind of regulate. We can sit here and talk about this until all of us are 10, 15 years old. That I want the policemen to be able to go home too. But there's a point where, what could we have done right at the beginning to stop it from getting bad? That's kind of where I'm leading right here.
And a lot of it go through situations that we go through with scenarios. So, I mean, for me personally, just being on the beat and actually going into an in-service and going through those scenarios, that's the first thing that you're doing for typically every scenario, is trying to de-escalate, trying to establish rapport, trying to communicate with the person to kind of see what's going on. So it's not like we're just going into a scenario and it's, you know, like gung-ho or something crazy. It's establishing that communication, because that's the most important thing first, and trying to de-escalate and see what our other options are instead of using force.
Thank you. So I've got Alan next, and then we'll probably bring it back around to you, Bonnie.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the last sentence of this section, 801.3.1, the sentence before the one that got added, where it says the application of any pain compliance technique will be discontinued once the officer determines that compliance has been achieved, or if the compliance technique is proving ineffective. And I guess if I got what Lindsay and Bonnie are talking about, is that is insufficient language to prevent or to stipulate that it shouldn't be used in a punitive fashion. So I'm wondering if that language in there, we could add something in there that has maybe another modifier in there that would help us move forward.
Yeah, I suggested the no use of punitive pain compliance.
I guess I mean, how do you determine what that is, though? That's the problem with that language. You know, what's punitive is in the eye of the beholder, I suspect. If someone thinks they're being, so I think that just saying that might not be sufficient, or might not be clear enough, might even muddy the waters even more.
Yeah. I did say, I see Lindsay's hand now. I also brought up Bonnie. I've got myself on the queue next. For my comment, I was just going to comment on the general policy in, you know, we could try to list every scenario or every technique that could ever possibly be used and which situations that was allowable in. And that would be a very strict policy manual. But my understanding is that many of the problems, the reason the CRB exists is not because the policy manual isn't always followed. And I think making it longer makes it less likely to be followed, simply because people have trouble remembering it. So for me, the question isn't whether this nails down every hypothetical, but rather, does it provide the CRB with enough tools to hold people accountable who should be held accountable, and recognize when somebody did their best with the tools they had in the situation they were confronted with. So that's sort of where I'm coming at it from. Bonnie, do you have something you would like to add to the conversation? And then Lindsay, is your hand still up, or did you? Okay.
I just wanted Bonnie to go first.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I think it definitely needs a little, at least for me, it needs a little bit more time in like how the work goes. So I agree with Alan that maybe there is something that at the end that can be kind of worded out a little clearer. Because I feel like the A through the G kind of almost touches on the point that I'm trying to get at, which is essentially, if, for example, and this only applies to this specific example because I've thought in my head of different scenarios where maybe it wouldn't apply, but in the chained up scenario, when people are chained up together, and if you, for example, were to pepper spray them, it just seems like they wouldn't necessarily just, you know, be able to leave from that situation. It's not like that would even be really effective. They're just stuck. So I think it's like if a person is trapped, you can't, even if they trap them, it just kind of seems like you're just being punitive in that sense. And I've been trying to figure out the words for that, but do you get what I'm saying, and how maybe it's not necessarily called out in this little section? There's a way to call out what I'm trying to say.
So the way I read that last section, where if it's ineffective, then obligate that they stop, to me does tell me that somebody an officer who, you know, tried to use one of these techniques against somebody who couldn't comply would be out of policy if I were on the CRB, for example. So I think I need a little bit more clarity to understand what, you know, where your problem with it lies.
Well, I think it's like, because it's saying if it doesn't work, like you already tried it, but it's just like, well, these people are chained together. Why are you even pepper spray them? Like, it doesn't really seem like it just that at that point it just seems punitive. Like, okay, so you try it even though like obviously they can't get out of that. So that's what I'm saying. Just like, don't just pepper spray them. Not that I'm saying that they're going to, and that I think Sergeant Ryan Maloney was saying that they don't do that, but but just don't do it. And I think I've seen in the policy, it generally says it's just like use your best judgment. And I guess in this section doesn't really say use your best judgment. Like if it's not going to work, don't do it, or use your best judgment as to not be punitive.
It says before, only when an officer reasonably believes that the use of such a technique appears necessary to further a legitimate law enforcement purpose. Is that not sufficient?
Well, and
we can add more.
If I can touch on that a little bit with Bonnie, I think I kind of see where you come from, Bonnie, but something to consider is that a lot of this, when it comes to this type of force we're talking about, these are Supreme Court decisions and Ninth Circuit Court decisions that govern whether or not it's lawful for us to even do that. And if it's illegal for us to do, or there's a crime involved in it, that obviously brings up separate matters where the policy violation isn't necessarily the big issue on it. It's the fact that it was a crime. So there's that to consider as well. So if you're applying some sort of force in an unreasonable and unnecessary circumstance, you're looking at potentially not following the law, and that makes it unlawful, which it null and voids the policy at that point. If you start branching into criminal activity.
And let's jump to Lindsay, and then give you a chance to think a lot about it as well.
So I have one question that's not related to what we're talking about. I'm just saying that out loud so I don't forget. So Dallas, you're speaking my language about de-escalation. I don't think you can overdo de-escalation. I want more training. I think that, yes, that is the best outcome, is to prevent something from escalating to the point where force needs to be used. That's like the gold standard. And one thing that I like about how this policy was changed since the last time that we saw it was that they added so we're talking about pain compliance as it relates to control holds. It's nested under the control holds segment. So that's 808.3. And I like that the language that the control holds need to be used consistent with the use of force policy and the de-escalation policy. The de-escalation policy was added in there too, which I think adds an additional layer of calling attention to the fact that we have a de-escalation policy and that officers are held to the standard of abiding by that. And that sort of is the preface for the pain compliance section. So that makes me feel more comfortable that that language has been added and that policy is specifically called out. Our use of force policy is also, is really worth looking at. Like, again, that light nighttime reading. I think it's a pretty good policy, and I know a lot of people have worked over many years to continue to refine it and make it something that meets community expectation and law enforcement need. My other question, as separate from all this, that I would just not clear about is under the impact weapon section 808.4, there's some text, all the text related to the 40 millimeter sponge round and extended range impact weapons is crossed out in red. And I didn't know if that's because it's going to become a separate policy, kind of like the tear gas below it, or I just wasn't sure what the notation meant.
I think that has to do with Chief Skinner's command directive, yes?
Yeah, I can answer to that too. Yeah, it is going to be a separate policy. So we just took it out of there completely. And then the command directive is what Chief Skinner just explained to you earlier. So that's what's in place now. until the new policy will be written.
Super, thanks. I assumed that, but I thought maybe I shouldn't assume, I should just ask. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
If I can just clarify really quick here, I don't want to de-emphasize or underdo the importance of de-escalation. It is the staple of what we're trying to work on and the staple of where we're trying to go. The reason I haven't talked about it a lot during this conversation is because we're more or less talking about the pain compliance control holds and that kind of stuff that de-escalation portion has either failed or didn't work or whatever it may be. So we've kind of moved past that. So that's why I was talking about that. But I don't disagree that the de-escalation is definitely on the forefront of importance within the department as well as our training section.
Excellent. Thank you. Bonnie, do you have further thoughts, maybe adding a sentence after the legitimate law enforcement purpose, or maybe adding a note there that says, only when it's has a reasonable chance of success, or something else entirely? You're muted if you're trying to say something. You're still muted. I don't know if that's intentional or if we've lost you to technical difficulties.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry I cut out. I don't know what was said. I would like to just take back any, I think that Sergeant Ryan Maloney has addressed what I would with regard to the pain compliance. So I'd like to just stop that, and I didn't hear anything else. Sorry.
Yeah, so I was asking if you wanted to add a bullet point to that list, saying that pain compliance will only be used when it has a reasonable chance of success, or maybe a sentence earlier, if that would address your concerns about.
Oh, actually, that's actually really well worded. Yes, that sounds good.
I need a little help on that one.
So, okay, so basically the problem that I've seen so far, as Bonnie has illustrated, which I did not see at first, is that by this language, it's entirely possible for a cop to see somebody who is doing something they don't like. They can tell for one reason or another that pain compliance won't work, but they don't like them, so they go up and do it anyway. That scenario is not outside of policy as it is currently written. As long as they only try it once, then it's kosher. I think this would also allow officers to, not attempt a pain compliance technique if it obviously wouldn't work.
I know, but the officers do not have a crystal ball. I mean, at some point, you can't look at somebody and say, this is what I'm going to do, and it might work or it might not work, and I'm going to get in trouble if I do the wrong thing. I don't buy that. I don't buy it. I really don't.
We also have to make sure that what we're doing is objectively reasonable. So I like how Lindsay had pointed out the use of force policy, because it lays it out really nicely. It's 800, it's policy 800, and it has a lot of good bullet points in there that I would just strongly encourage folks to read that as well, as you're kind of looking at this, the handcuffing and obviously the resistance that we're talking about now too. So it's kind of an all-encompassing type deal.
Sorry, I get sometimes when I'm like, I have read it and sometimes I just focus in on like one section. I'm like, well, it's not addressing it here. So I just get a little worried.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of value to specifically calling out that part of the use of force policy, doubling it up here, because when the community looks up our policies, they see this. It's just nice to have that, frankly, little cover your ass language in there to drive the point home. V? Yeah, V. You're muted still, but yeah.
I kept myself muted and then I have to unmute. I have a suggestion, since we can't really figure out what we want to do to add on to the policy at the moment. Why don't we come back to it another time, we can bring that back. It's not a done deal kind of thing, right?
I think this is the last time I want to put it on the agenda. I'd like to knock it out here, and I think.
But the problem
I think
is,
we're almost there.
like, we can agree to any, finality to adding something in there at the moment. We do have another policy to review too, I think.
Yep, we got 5 minutes on that before we are over schedule. So I've got Chantel and then Alan.
I just have a quick question too. How often would you say the pain compliance techniques are used, like when you show up to a dispute? Like, are they used, I don't know, in 70% of the interactions you have, or I'm just wondering.
I do the use of force reviews every year as far as our recordable use of forces, and the pain compliance is one of those things. And to be honest with you, the amount of calls we go to, and like you mentioned, disputes, we use disputes, we go on. Pain compliance is used, and you said 70. I would argue it's closer to 5 to 10% of the time.
Thank the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Yeah, definitely. And that's really, we're doing a good job when we can show up somewhere and leave without ever having to touch anybody. Really, I mean, it's our job is to show up and communicate well with people, help resolve them, allow them access to the resources that we have access to 24 hours a day that we can get things resolved with. And that's a win. That's a win for us, win for everybody involved. The last resort is the hands-on and the handcuffing, arrest, that kind of stuff. If we have a lawful requirement that we have to arrest, but we want to do that in the most peaceful possible way and humane and respectful way, to be honest with you.
Excellent. So Alan, I've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just reading down below in 808.4, there's the second paragraph. I'm wondering if we can't use that language in a different way in 808.3.1, like for instance, saying pain compliance should not be used punitively or to intimidate or coerce subject into doing anything except to overcome the resistance to being taken into custody. That's the same language you have below for the impact weapons,
paragraph,
except for the passive resistance part, because I think passive pain compliance is part of overcoming passive resistance, if I got what the sergeant said.
Yeah. Does anybody have any objections or
objections to what?
So taking the paragraph, impact weapons should not be used to strike persons engaged only in passive resistance, blah, blah, that paragraph right there after 808.4.
And then instead have it say, pain compliance should not be used punitively or to intimidate or coerce subjects into doing anything except to overcome their resistance of being taken into custody.
And adding that to 808.3.
Copy, yeah, bring that up at the end there of 808.3.1.
I would say just briefly, as far as the except to overcome the resistance being taken into custody, that's actually the point of some of this pain compliance is to overcome that resistance being taken into custody.
Yeah. So that the policy, as Alan laid it out, would allow for that.
Yeah, you can use it, except
but only for that. Lindsay, I've got your hand up.
That I just want to make sure. I'm going to ask one clarifying question about that. So it wouldn't. So is pain compliance used for anything else other than taking people into custody?
Shouldn't
so
be.
If it's not, so that I'm just making sure like the language doesn't somehow create some kind of practical problem. So if it's so it's sort of implicitly right now not used for anything but taking people into custody, and Councilman Zelenka's suggestion for changing the language would just make that explicit and would just mirror the language that's in the policy below it, so it should be familiar. That seems like a reasonable path forward from my perspective.
Something to consider too is that based on the general use of force policy, if it's force that's used in a reasonable, but objectively reasonable based on the totality of circumstances that the officer knows at the time it's being implemented. There would be times that we could use a pain compliance technique where we aren't affecting arrest. We're simply stopping a physical dispute from occurring, or we're stopping a process from happening. That's not uncommon at all.
And that was my and that was my concern. If we put the language from the impact weapons in the pain compliance section, if there are other, like you just described a situation that is not affecting an arrest necessarily, but that a pain compliance technique might be the right tool and the appropriate level of force for the job, I want to make sure not to create any kind of conflicts like that with the language. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. We would have regretted that later. So seeing the way this conversation's going, I would accept a motion to accept the policies as they've been written. Otherwise, I'd accept any motions folks might have to change stuff, but we're not going to get another chance to look at this until our next work plan. So I want to have something written for our officers to go on in the foreseeable future.
I want to second the motion that it stays exactly as it is.
Okay. So technically I'm not allowed to make motions, so thank you for making that motion, Dallas. Do we have a second? Thanks, V. Everybody in favor say aye or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Silver. I see Bonnie. Macy, I thought I saw you as well, but I wasn't sure.
Aye.
Thank you.
Aye.
So that is unanimous. Thank you all. I know it's a lot of talking, but I think I feel better for one about making sure we do our due diligence. And with that, we can move on to the civil disturbances policy, 317.
Just as a quick follow-up, Sean,
yes.
We are going to discuss tear gas as a separate policy, maybe as part of our work plan for next year.
Yeah, I'm going to try to fit it in before the work plan, honestly, but I don't want to make promises about future agendas with how much stuff is changing all the time.
Yeah, thanks for
yeah, so that and Citizens Police Academy is another one that I want to get to before we get to our next work plan. Did I see Ryan Maloney?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something real quick. I have another issue I have to go attend to, so I've got to get off at this point. I want to say thanks for having me. I appreciate these conversations and the opportunity to learn from each other. So I do want to put out there too that at any point, if you guys have questions outside of this type of stuff, I am a resource within the police department. So I'm not on one side or the other. I'm just a resource for you guys. So I want to help make this better for everybody. So if you have questions or things that come up other than what's in the agenda on these types of things that I can help with, feel free to reach out to me. I'll get back to you for sure.
Thank you so much. We're going to try to go through Jeremy for such things, but very much appreciate your willingness and hope everything goes okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so civil disturbances. Sergeant Nelson, do you want to start by reading through some of the changes we've made over the last? Yes.
Yeah, sure, you bet. Yeah, I wasn't sure how you wanted to do this, so just let me know what works best for all of you, and I will be happy to do that. So this is one that Kyle and I both kind of went through. So this was really my first stab at something. So looking back at it, there weren't a lot of significant changes on it. I think I also did vet this through our legal counsel through the city attorney's office, just to make sure, because there were some things on here about recording and monitoring of events, which are important to make sure that we got those accurate. We made all those changes in there. I think the one thing that we did have in our old policy is that 317.3 used to say that we will basically remove people from roadways if people are blocking it during a public assembly. And that's just not, if you've, and Lindsay will be able to confirm this, but that's just not what we've been doing. And so we want to attempt to do that because I think that's an important function, and we think that's an important function of the police department. But we wanted to give the incident commander an opportunity, basically depending upon what the command objectives are. I mean, if we're determining that it would cause the situation to become worse, or there weren't many issues as far as with traffic and stuff, then the incident commander could make the decision to not do that. And we could, like in some of the last protests that we had, there were multiple times where we had officers that were just actually blocking roadways so that everyone could actually walk down the middle of the road to do that. So that's kind of a big shift, one of our bigger shifts that we had in this policy. And again, we took away what we had in our previous policy. The officers had a lot of discretion as to arrests and enforcement. And as you can see in this new language, that the direction of the incident commander is added to a lot of these lines here, so that the incident commander will make the decision as to when those things will take place. I think the only, there's some minor changes. And then the one thing that I did add on 317.54 is our video procedure, that 3.17 video recording and monitoring events. I mean, and that's mirrored directly off of state law. So there's a state law that allows police agencies to record certain events and not record other events, and that's for protection of privacy and people's rights. And so we have that language in our 3.17 policy. And I confirmed with the city attorney that language is still accurate, and it's still the best practice for us to have. So I referred it back just to make sure, even though I did it up on the top portion of the summary of it, I wanted to make sure when people were reading this that they'd actually would hit it again to make sure that they knew when they could record and monitor events. I think other than that, there were some other just minor changes that we've done in procedure stuff. Added the probable cause for arrest in 317B6 or 317.62, and so if you look under, sorry, if I'm going too fast, just let me know, you guys.
We'll have questions after to touch on anything.
Perfect.
Fast is good.
17.6 4B, you'll notice I struck that whole piece out of there. I met with Kyle and we discussed that. That's an old general order that is literally cannot find anymore. And in the discussions that we had on that, and also this was sent out to the entire department for feedback from the department as well. But if there were to be a sniper incident in a case like this or in a situation like this, it would be so dependent upon the surroundings, the amount of people, there'd just be so many moving parts and pieces that didn't think it was appropriate to put it into this policy. And there was the old general order, we couldn't even find it to see what it actually read. Yeah. So we made the decision to go ahead and pull that out of there. And I didn't get any feedback of that being pulled out by individual folks in the department. So we just left it as it sets for there. And then so just some other little minor adjustments from there. So I think that's, and the other piece, we did recognize in some of these last protests that there was a little bit of a disconnect around getting a case manager for these, because it's important for one person or maybe even a couple people, depending upon how big of an event it is, for them to be the case manager, so they get all of the information together so stuff just doesn't get missed. And so we added in there to coordinate with investigations lieutenant to determine the assignment of a case or of an investigative case manager. Other than that, I don't think there's really much else. So those were kind of your high points.
Okay. Yeah, let's open it up for questions. Alan, did I see you moving around or did I see your hand? Okay, so Dallas then, and then I'll have myself on the queue next.
I just have a question on 317.7, number 6, where it says all juveniles are handed handled in accordance with department policy? Help me out on that. Like what? What's happening to those juveniles?
So we have specific policy related to juvenile arrests and what you have to do and all the requirements and the legal requirements. And so that's what it's addressing, is that they'll be handled in accordance with department policy, and there's a specific policy for that.
Do they go someplace separate? Do they go someplace separate?
Oh yes.
Where?
Like we have, so if they were going to be physically arrested, then they would be taken to SERBU, to Juvenile Justice Center, and that's under 18 only at that center. If they were to be cited, there's specific policies around a specific policy around citing of juveniles and contacting either parents or guardians or others responsibles. Oh, thank you, Naivasha. She just posted on the chat there. Policy 324 is juvenile custody. She beat you to it, Sean.
Yep.
So that's referring you to that policy. That's the department policy as it relates to juvenile arrests and custodies.
And we looked at it just before you joined, Dallas. So that's why some people are nodding their heads and some people feel lost, is because we've looked at it fairly recently, but we can look at it again for sure.
No, my concern was is that if this is something, I mean, people might just want to know where that place is, where is the juvenile?
Like a reference within the policy, like a reference to that actual policy number that Naivasha just posted. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
That'd be useful. So I've got myself on the queue next, and then Jennifer. For my questions, the first, I think, most pressing one is I see a mass arrests section. I think, given the recent events, are there any policies or procedures or expectations when we talk about mass arrests in the context of armed resistance?
That's a good question, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm still getting my feet wet here. As far as for armed instances, you mean as like actively just armed people, or active resistance with people who are armed?
Active resistance by people who are armed. So they might not be using the firearms. I think that would be pretty obvious, but they might be threatening to use them.
Sure. No, I don't believe that there is a specific policy related to that. And Naivasha, if you know something different, please feel free to jump in. But I mean, all of those things are dealt with dependent upon the circumstance and the situation that unfolds. So I don't know that any specific policy exists related to that particular scenario, though, Sean.
Okay.
I do that as well as what Sergeant Nelson was saying. We do have an arrest group that we typically have on kind of when we're trying to effect a mass arrest. So that's something that tactically they would typically discuss and figure out how to go about doing that in the safest manner.
Yeah, good point.
I think it would be very nice if that made its way to Chief, because I don't see him on the call either. And my second question was in section 317.3, part 2, section B. There is an ongoing debate about the exclusivity of private property open to the public, e.g. malls, clinics, etc. Is that direction towards the incident commander, or is that something that needs to be nailed down in policy still?
So say that one more time, Sean, just so I understand what you're asking.
It just says there is an ongoing debate about the exclusivity of private property open to the public, about whether, I assume this applies, and that there is the direction in here to check with the city attorney.
Yeah, I didn't hear your last part about the incident commander. I'm sorry, I didn't clarify my question.
Yeah, is this subsection related to, is the policy for the incident commander to follow, or is this is this a note that we still need to check with the city attorney before we can write this section?
I understand what you're asking now. No, I did speak with the city attorney about that. It's Ben Miller, and he basically had said that it's still a case-by-case situation. There's a ruling, a Oregon Supreme Court ruling that would apply in some cases and not in others. So he said he could give some examples as to times when this would be allowed and when it would not be allowed, but it wouldn't be a complete list. So it's safer to err on the side of caution, so that if an incident commander is thinking about taking any enforcement in a scenario like that, then they would need to reach out to legal counsel to talk about that and make sure that that was something was legally justified.
Sweet. Thank you. Jennifer and then Lindsay.
One of my questions. Thanks for being here there, Sean.
Your audio's a little bit off. Can you mute and unmute again?
You sound like a robot.
Do I still sound like a robot?
A little bit.
Yeah, I'm gonna log back on.
All right. Thank you so much. So let's jump to Lindsay while we wait for Jennifer to get back.
So I like the change in language about the roadways. That peaceful protesters blocking sidewalks, for example, would not necessitate an intervention. I appreciate that, and I totally agree that when I was watching all that video, that's not what I saw EPD doing. Even though it was written into the policy, what I saw for the most part was when people weren't blocking major roadways, that what I saw for the most part, while officers maybe were moving people away from certain areas, they weren't stopping or arresting people or preventing them from protesting just because they were blocking a sidewalk or just because they were blocking a minor side street and were occupying the space and using it as a form of their protest. So I appreciate that the language in the policy now reflects what I think I saw happening, but what wouldn't have been required to happen.
Yes.
I also appreciate, having watched all the video that I've watched, and gained more appreciation for how very dangerous blocking a bridge in town could be for emergency response or other things, that language in this policy still lets you take care of that, right? And so this new language helps me a lot. It gives the discretion to allow the protesters to occupy the street, to occupy the sidewalks as part of their demonstration. They have the right to that space. That's great. And that when it's unsafe and when it needs to, be intervened, you have the room to do that. So I appreciate the work that went into that. And the reflection that it takes to think like, oh, actually our practices are different than how this policy reads, to the benefit of the protesters in this case. Okay. So that's good. I have a clarifying question, because there's just like a pile of things I don't know on the last 317.9. So that's the use of canines. First of all, I like 317.9. The first point, police service dogs will not be used for crowd control activities. That's something we should just, thank you. Let's not be Birmingham, Alabama. That's bad. What I don't understand is in the what the difference between using a service dog for crowd control activities is, and the second point, which is that police service dogs can be used in support roles like staging areas. That I understand. And it says in situations where their expertise like tracking is needed to apprehend criminals, okay, and in patrol activities. That last part, like, and in patrol activities, what would be the difference between using them in a patrol activity versus as in a crowd control activity? Like, those are just technical terms I'm not super familiar with.
Sure. So the kind of the flavor behind that, what that is talking about is like, if there is a crowd or there is a major assembly of people, and say there's an individual crime or individual things that happen during that event that lead us to need to make an arrest, and somebody runs or flees from the area, then it allows that canine to be in the area to be able to do that particular job, but not as it relates to the crowd, as it relates to actual individual criminal activity within that group or out that left the group.
Got it. So you're not using dogs to scare people away or to move a crowd. No. You would be using it to specifically apprehend a person engaging in criminal behavior who happens to be in the vicinity of a crowd.
Yes.
Am I understanding
or could have even been part of the crowd initially. So for example, like say there's an event that takes place and there's an assault that takes place within that event, and then the suspect runs from that event and now is outside of that event or in the peripheral of that event, then a canine could be used to apprehend that particular person related to the crime that took place within the crowd itself, if that makes sense.
But it's not being used as a crowd control management tool.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So I've got Jennifer and then V and then Alan on the queue.
Okay, do I sound normal now? Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. Lindsay also asked my second question, so I should just go last always. The only other thing I had, and it's not, I don't know that it's a question, but as I was reading it, there really isn't, or at least I didn't see anything that addresses when people start to disperse. So maybe once people start to disperse, this policy doesn't apply in any way. Is that accurate?
So let me take a look here. So we'll talk about it kind of falls under that the deactivation portion of it, the 317.8. Once the disturbance is brought under control, the incident commander designee should ensure all the following tasks. So that would be like everything is done for the most part because you're removing the civil disturbance equipment from the area, gradually removing extra staffing from the area. So typically what we do in these situations is we'll keep officers in the area, kind of just roving around the area to make sure that a crowd doesn't come back together and cause more problems. And then as officers are roving around and they're providing information to the incident commander about what they're seeing and things are really mopping up and wrapping up, then that's where that portion of the policy comes into play.
Okay, I guess my only concern was that I can see how, okay, you've got people in case they come back together, but like, what about the folks that are now in groups of, 3 or 4, and now they're causing trouble, but they're not really part of the group anymore, but there's like, it doesn't actually tell you that you need to care about that. And maybe that's just because it's obvious and that's just, now we're just into normal policing and we don't need to, or does there need to be something in there that says like the incident commander needs to be trying to keep track of these people? Or
Sure. No, and that's a great question. Really good question. I can tell you in 19 years, I've been involved in a few of them. And how it actually works is the group disperses, officers are in the area saturating, and they're looking for potential stuff that comes up, like you mentioned, 2 or 3 or 4 people. And then those are dealt with individually in those situations. For quite some time after the event, there's usually an incident commander that is still monitoring everything that's going on and still listening at everything. And then at some point in time, it becomes clear that things have dispersed and people have dispersed. And then if there are little events that pop up, just like you said, it usually ends up becoming a patrol type function. And the incident command system is actually shut down because it's no longer necessary because it's not a large scale event any longer. So that's the practice. That's been so there's a lot of things that I explained earlier, tactics that we've changed as far as, we're allowing a lot more than we used to. Back in the years back, I remember when if a group of protesters stepped off the sidewalk into the street, it was an immediate response, right? And so like Chief Skinner said earlier, we're learning from all of these things over the years and we're getting better and we're improving. So, but what you described there is something that we've always done. And I think that will capture those potential issues that could come up from 1 or 2 or 3 people that might decide they want to cause some additional problems. And that is the practice.
okay. So if you're satisfied and it makes sense, the officers and everything gets transferred smoothly, then I'm happy. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Sweet. So I've got V and then Alan and then myself on the queue again.
Yeah. So Sergeant Nelson, my question is really, I think it's going to be the most simplest of all the questions. So I'm wondering, are arrestees and prisoners interchangeable in as far as a couple terms there?
Yeah, they totally could be. Can you tell me which one, where you're?
Yeah, I'm looking at the section 317.7 mass arrests.
Okay.
It looks like number 1 the term used is prisoner. And number 4, it should be prisoner. If not, then both of them should be the same, arrestee or prisoner, because they both seem to be, you know, used in the same context.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and we certainly could look at that. There's no the terminology between those two, it could very well be the same. It doesn't. There's no differentiation between the two of those. So I see what you're saying.
Okay, thank you.
Alan, sorry, I was muted.
Yeah, so yeah, you just use prisoners in that whole paragraph.
Yeah.
I like the addition of the incident commander. Maybe you can speak to why that was instituted. I think what it means to me is that now you've taken kind of the discretion away from the officers to do a lot of these things and placed it in the hands of the incident commander, which ostensibly would be a more senior and experienced EPD officer, and therefore have a little bit more understanding about some of the nuances, but also other circumstances and how they were applied in the history. And is that the rationale?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I thought Chief Skinner spoke with this group about it, but one of the things, and it may have been, I get confused with CRB too, because I go to that as well. But one of the things that we have learned as a department, I think that has been really useful, is that we need to have senior people that are running these every single time, so that there's consistency, so that the message from the chief and from command staff is brought down and carried out. And so to add those extra layers of having that incident command making those decisions, because they know the mission, they know what the chief is asking for, and they're the ones that are best to make those high level decisions like that. It just makes it that much smoother and more consistent.
How does that physically occur? Everybody's on a radio and they call in and ask?
So most of the communication takes place over the radio. Yes, that's accurate. The incident commander is typically, depending upon the size of the incident could be talking to, it's usually going to be a lieutenant that's going to be your incident commander on one of these via the radio, but they're usually having conversations depending upon what's going on with potentially a captain or maybe even the chief for that matter, and they'll be passing those directives down to officers to make those decisions.
Yeah, if I could add just a couple of things from that. Sorry about having to jump off. The idea, Councilor Zelenka, is to try and remove emotion out of decision making. And when you're on the ground in the middle of the quote unquote fight, it's really hard not to make emotional decisions. And so creating layers are important. So typically what would happen, like one of our bigger protests, we would have field force teams. We would have a field force commander that's out in the field trying to monitor what's going on. That would be a lieutenant. The incident commander would be in a separate location. That would probably be a captain. And in the early stages of our protest back on May 29th and into first day of June, I was in with the captain trying to make decisions about or help make decisions about some things, because at some point there will be a question that will come through the radio or through the chain of command that may be a policy decision that has to be made. It's not a tactical decision, it's a policy decision. Great example of that. Should we or should we not use gas based on the totality of the circumstances? That is a policy decision that we make. And that's one that the CRB got a memo from me that says that was made with my authority on those nights to use gas. And so creating those layers is really important to our command and control structure so that we're not making those decisions emotionally.
Yeah, I think that's a really good add, Chief. And this is a good example of why that would make sense. In 317.31A, I understand the change there, preserve the public right of ways, for instance, completely blocking the Ferry Street Bridge when there's only 3 ways to get across the river here. And if you're having a heart attack and you need to get to the hospital and the ambulance needs to go that way, I can see how not wanting to have that right away be clogged up with protesters is really important. On that same 3.173(1)A, the incident commander may deviate from this if it conflicts with established command objectives. I didn't know what that meant.
We will try to establish command objectives with every ops plan will have command objectives. And for instance, in crowd control, and again, I'm sorry since I was gone, but I'm assuming, and that's the context we're having this conversation, is around crowd control or protest management. If the command objective is to allow, we usually will articulate ahead of time what we are and aren't going to allow. And if the command objective is we will allow for a peaceful march. Technically, what we're doing is we're approving essentially we're approving the crime of disorderly conduct in our streets. We're allowing them to engage in disorderly conduct by blocking traffic, but in the command directive, we'll articulate specifically where we're okay with that happening and where we're not. And so while we would say, hey, the 105 off ramp or on ramp is off limits, the Ferry Street Bridge is off limits, the ingress into UDH is off limits, but the ancillary streets in and around the downtown we're fine with that. That might be where you have kind of a command directive that allows for essentially people to take over the streets and technically commit the crime of disorderly conduct.
Yeah, so it's case by case command objectives as we go into them. Yeah, okay.
Sweet. So I've got myself on the queue next.
I had one more.
Oh, okay.
I didn't on 317.8.5. I understand what an incident commander does, but I don't understand what a case manager does. And why what their job is and why we need them.
Sorry, I wasn't fast enough. I'm stuck at home on a laptop and I only have one screen. I'm trying to go back and forth and I was muted. I apologize. Case managers are really important to have all of the information together. So if there was criminal activity that took place, all officers write reports based upon their observations and what they did at the scene. So to have all of that information be able to be given to one or maybe two people, depending upon the size of the incident, so that they can put that all together in one place and manage that. And if there's any additional investigations that need to take place outside of the event itself, say there was property crimes, there were some violent crimes that occurred during the course of that event, then that would be a responsibility of that case manager, is to ensure something doesn't fall through the cracks or get missed, and just to have one or two eyes on it to make sure everything's taken care of.
So that's done as at the beginning of the incident?
No, that's usually going to be done
or after.
Yeah,
after.
That's one of your deactivation pieces at the end, where the incident commander liaisons with the investigations lieutenant to determine who that case manager would be, and it's usually going to be a detective from one of the divisions upstairs through our detective divisions.
Okay. And it's usually somebody that's not intimately involved in the action. So again, as a layer of insulation, we're not going to make a case manager somebody that was just in the middle of this fight, that was maybe a part of this. It's somebody that can take a step back, has the discretionary time to pull it all together, and isn't emotionally involved in what just happened. They can be really objective about pulling the case together.
Okay. And finally, changing videotape to video made me feel old.
Awesome. So I asked a question which you had to step out for, Chief, which was around specifically mass arrests, but I suppose it could be relevant to any arrest. When we see a crowd that is armed, largely or mostly armed, what steps are taken in that context, given the way the world seems to be going these days?
Yeah, it depends on what we're arresting them for. So that's the thing. Being armed is not a criminal offense. Unfortunately, in the state, we're an open carry state, and we have several individuals that would like to remind you of their Second Amendment right by showing up openly carrying. But the piece that I will tell you is, and you'll have seen this throughout the summer when we've managed these protests, is that we do try to do the best job we can of of evaluating the crime that's occurring and whether or not us inserting ourselves into that really potentially violent situation is worth actually making that arrest. You know, if we catch somebody spray painting the side of the building, but we have to go through 20 people that are slung with AR-15s, you have to be smart about, you know, where you're going to insert yourself and where you're not. But we have been really careful and intentional around trying to find small pockets of what we would consider instigators or criminal behavior and try to surgically go in and make those arrests without alerting, you know, or out trying to draw attention to ourselves to the other, you know, the huge crowd, because you can imagine how that could go sideways as well. So really it's kind of on a case by case basis, Sean, based on the severity of the crime, whether or not we have adequate personnel to safely go in and do that. The misnomer we have is it's like, hey, you got a single bad guy. It takes more than one officer to deal with a single bad guy. We need to have an arrest team and we need to have a cover team. So it's like a minimum of 4 officers per individual that we try to take into custody, 2 to kind of protect the officers while they're doing their business because they're going hands-on, and 2 to safely take somebody into custody. So there's just a lot of moving parts to that.
So under what circumstances would we want to do mass arrests versus, as we saw with the 29th incident, you know, taking video, identifying folks and following up afterwards?
Mm-hmm. You know, the mass arrest situation may be more. Trying to think of some situations. The majority of the mass arrest situations I've been involved in, I go back to my time working for the sheriff's office, where we had, you know, 30 people chained to a piece of equipment that was going to log this particular area, and they're trespassing, and they've all been given a chance to leave and they haven't left, and the owner wants everybody trespassed. I mean, you have that kind of controlled environment where all 30 people are going to get cited for trespass, which is a mass arrest, that type of thing. Those static types of situations around protests where law's been violated or broken, and and everybody is being treated the same and everybody's being arrested. For us, we're not going to see a lot of mass arrest situations in where we have a little skirmish here and a little skirmish there. You're going to go in and you're going to pick off 2 or 3 here, pick off 2 or 3 there. Now, by the end of the night, if you have 30 people you've arrested, you could consider that was a mass arrest. But as far as trying to arrest 30 people at a time, we're very rarely going to be in a situation where A, we have the personnel to do that safely, or B, the circumstance is going to warrant that.
Okay. And my final question, hopefully, is, you know, for ones where, for events where we know it's happening, where I know it's happening beforehand, I assume have an incident commander who's ready to go beforehand. How do they decide when something goes from peaceful protest to civil disturbance? Right.
Well, there's certainly some thresholds there. You know, riotous behavior is easily defined. In some cases, it's a little bit of a judgment call based on what they're seeing on the ground. This is the disconnect between maybe the incident commander and the field force commander that's out there actually experiencing the tone and the tenor of the crowd. You know, the incident commander is sitting someplace feeling very, very comfortable as they're watching this unfold, and the people that are on the street really know. You know, it's kind of like watching a game on TV and actually being on the sidelines. It's 2 completely different experiences. Mostly that unlawful assembly declaration and or riot declaration specifically centers around criminal behavior. And the 25th is a great example of that. July 25th is a great example of that. We went through several evolutions of following groups in and around downtown before we finally declared that a riot. And, you know, we had gone through periods of graffiti. We had gone through periods of low-level crime like breaking windows. And it wasn't until they started ripping signs out of the ground and trying to light the Elkhorn Brewery on fire that we said, okay, enough's enough. And so it really is around the escalation of the criminal behavior that sets that. And so last weekend, when we declared an unlawful assembly, that was preempted in the fact that we were moving in on a small group of people that were fighting. And then we saw, and then what the incident commander or what the field force commander saw in the ground was the 70 other protesters started to make their way towards that. And that's when we declared, hey, basically back up and back off and get out of here, because it could have gotten bad in a hurry if our officers were ascended upon by 70 protesters at that point. So it is somewhat of a judgment call. I'm not going to lie about that.
And, you know, I saw the videos of last week as well, and particularly concerned about the judgment call in rescinding such a declaration. And I think we need to include something about that in the policy.
Well, I'm not sure that it was rescinded. When you say rescinded, once it's declared, once you declare it's an unlawful assembly, do you tell people to disperse, and they do disperse? Then when you mean rescinded, what I think of rescinded is I mean, oh, I'm going to take it back now. If that same group came back together in that same kind of behavior, I'm not sure that we wouldn't have approached it the same way. My understanding of that day, based on what I saw or what I heard from the debrief, is that group, once we declared an unlawful assembly and directed them on which way they were supposed to go, it sounded like and looked like we got a fair amount of compliance at that point. And so, you know, we don't want to escalate our level of force. If they're starting to de-escalate, we want to de-escalate with them. And so we could have a good conversation about what that means to rescind that, or what maybe you saw that I don't know about. But you know, that one's a little bit of a tricky one. The question becomes, if you declare an unlawful assembly at the corner of 8th and Mill and say time to disperse, and all of those people technically disperse and then gather up again at Kesey Square, but are doing it peacefully, does that still just go with them? And now you're going to go down there and hammer them at Kesey Square because they chose that? It really is a delicate balancing act on First Amendment free speech and what their behavior is at the time. So
yeah, I know I don't want to get into specific incidents. I was concerned by the way that same crowd, you know, 20 feet away, regathered and then spent a bunch of time talking about how they scared the cops away, which makes me fear further escalation in the future.
Well, they're feeling pretty good about themselves at that point. You know, I can appreciate that. At this point, if that's the narrative that they want to feel good about themselves, if they somehow scared us away, then I guess that's, you know, what's interesting to me is you didn't certainly see them poking the bear after that to see if they had the upper hand. So my guess is that you know, most of those groups will tell themselves anything they need to hear to justify why they're there.
Are y'all using the word rescind? I don't think that y'all two are on the same page as far as the word, how y'all using the word rescind.
You are right.
You are right. Yeah.
I was using it to, you know, describe something that I saw. I think Chief is using it a little bit more accurately.
Yeah, the way he was using it, do we apologize for what we just did? No.
No.
Yeah, no. Cool. I've dominated, I think, enough of this conversation. If anybody else has questions you'd like to ask.
With respect to that, I was just wondering, do you have ways of recognizing, or have you been trained in a way to recognize militia type activity where it's not necessarily protesting, but you've got somebody? My understanding is if you have one person that's coordinating everybody else to do certain activities, do you have the abilities, like I see here that it says that you have points of surveillance, but is it like a red flag currently to see like sort of paramilitary type activity? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying, and it's a little bit of a complex question. So number one, we do the very best job we can to take up positions where we can observe all types of activity, both on the ground and in the air. And especially after the drones go in the air, after the first law is broken by statute. And that gives us the advantage to be able to watch the crowd, watch where they're going, see where they're going, especially when crowds have a tendency to break apart. One of the things we saw this last weekend is a group of Proud Boys that decided they wanted to walk through downtown while the rest of the group, or other parts of the group, were still up at 8th and Mill. They separate out, and it spreads us a little bit thin. And so the drones are really helpful for us to be able to maintain that. So yes, we take up positions where we can identify activity that causes us concern. The activity that we legislate is illegal activity. And so anything that they choose to do that is within the law or within their constitutional rights, we pay attention to, we take note of, but we don't intervene in or legislate just because we're not at a place where we can do that. The minute it crosses the line into criminal activity, that's where we can insert ourselves, and we'll do that if it makes sense based on kind of life safety priorities. So the fact that we have a bunch of armed, quote unquote, militia looking people, and you could probably ask 20 different people and get 20 different answers on what that looks like. All of them will probably say they have guns, would be the common answer in that. We are looking at the behavior, at their posture. We're communicating what we're seeing. We're being prepared in the event that something happens that allows us to intervene. But just by the very nature of their presence, we most likely would not intervene just because they were there and that they were militant looking.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other concerns or questions before we move on to a motion to accept this as it stands, or other changes you want to see before we do so?
I was just wondering about, there's a section here where pictures used to be taken of people that were being arrested, and I was just wondering why that was removed. Just curious.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, under 317.7 mass arrest number 4, it says all arrestees are searched, photographed, but then that's crossed out, and properly identified prior to transportation to jail. I was just wondering why that was scratched.
Yeah, that was a practice we used to use, and I checked in with Lieutenant Salisbury, who's really kind of heads all of this training up and helps the department out with it. We aren't using that practice anymore. The jail's really good about photographing everyone for us when they are brought there, so it's just not a practice that's being used any longer, so we struck it out of there.
Cool. Thank you all. I'd accept a motion to accept this policy as it stands. If anybody would like to make that motion.
I'll make that motion, Sean.
Thanks, Ian. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thanks.
Wait, sorry, I have one more question.
Okay, yeah, now it's technically the
sorry,
discussion period, so go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, so when do they photograph people then? Just upon arrival? Is that what you said? Sorry.
Yeah, no, so when you take someone to the jail, there's a book-in process that takes place. There's paperwork that gets filled out. They have a lot of questions that they're asked. And then when they bring them back and process them, once we release them to jail staff, the jail takes photographs of that. And it's through an accessible system for all law enforcement to be able to see those photographs. So again, it's just kind of, this was an older policy and it wasn't really necessary for us to be taking the photographs anymore. And then you run into, what do you do with the photographs and why do we need them when we have the ability to get them through the jail? Not even through the jail, we have access to the system itself. So we can pull those up whenever we need to.
So during a mass arrest, then let's say you have a ton of people. What does the process look like? How long after having been arrested would a person actually have a picture taken? Like, would they have spent some time in holding, if that's the right term, prior to having had a picture taken? That's entirely possible. We don't run the Lane County Jail, which is I'm thankful for that. It's their process, it's their timing. Sometimes they have times in the day where they have to do counts because they can only have a certain amount of people inside the jail for safety purposes and state requirements and federal requirements. So I mean, it can be a fairly quick process or it can be a fairly lengthy process, so that there is holding areas available, as that's where they would be while they're being processed or prior to being processed. I can't really give you a time frame on that, Bonnie, because it really is subject to how many arrests are there. And the other piece is, since it's Lane County Jail, Springfield takes custodies there. Well, not so much anymore because they have their own jail, but Oregon State Police takes custodies there. There are other agencies, Coburg Police Department, Junction City Police Department. So it just depends on who might be there, what their staffing levels are like
to determine how long they might be sitting and waiting before the photograph. But prior to their finality of their booking in the Lane County Jail, they will get a photograph taken of them by jail staff.
Kind of just being super negative in thought, it just seems to me that maybe a photograph might be a good way for Eugene police to cover their bases, so to speak. I don't know, I don't have any proof that Lane County handles their prisoners in any ill fashion, but to me it just seems like it would be nice to have that picture in case something were to happen. Then we can say, well, EPD had handed them over just fine, and I don't know what happened at that jail, but it was not these officers that did anything. So I just, I kind of feel like that's why that would be there. Yeah, because you have no control over what happens over there. So that's what I'm saying.
I was going to say, I think we can, that merits examination during any arrest, and we could probably address that during a general arrest policy. But if you have something to add to it, Sergeant Nelson.
Well, the one thing to remember is, just about in almost all cases, and I know this is going to be looked at even more so after all the CRB citizen or the review board looked at it, but we got body cam video, or we've got in-car video of our prisoners. And I mean, it would be really uncommon to have a prisoner actually taken to jail without any video of them in any place or any part in time. The other piece is that if somebody has been assaulted, they're typically going to tell somebody or what agency assaulted them. So if your concern is that they were assaulted by another agency, then that's usually something that somebody's going to be completely forthright and come out with. Is that covering what you're asking, Bonnie? Just want to make sure I'm covering it.
Sounds like it. What were you going to say?
There's also video in the jail. So the second that we're transporting somebody via our car and we have our in-car video, it's going to show us walking from the Sally Port all the way into the booking at the jail booking room. So there's quite literally video everywhere.
Okay. Thank you.
Sweet. Yeah, thank you. So we will call the question here. Everybody in favor of accepting this policy as it's currently written, say aye or raise your hand. Bonnie? Awesome. So that's unanimous, and we can move on to closing comments. For mine, I just want to thank everybody. I feel really privileged to work with this group. Lindsay, and then V.
Thanks, Sean. I totally agree. Thank you, everybody, for showing up and hearing each other and working together. I appreciate hearing from all of you. I learn something every time. So thank you for bearing with my questions. On that note, Sean, I don't know if and when we're going to look at the pepperball policy again, but I have more things to say now that I've watched a lot of video. Excellent. So I would like that to come back. Mm-hmm. I also don't know what your timeline is like to look at whatever the 40mm policy becomes, but that one would be another thing that I'd like to be at the top of the pile. And the tear gas policy. So if we can just kind of remember to keep those front of mind as we move forward. And I don't know whether that will be during this work plan or during the future work plan. I would really appreciate it. Thank you all. Thank you for your service. This is like, it's really hard to express how deeply upsetting, exhausting, terrifying the times that we live in are right now. So thank you all for showing up and being engaged and continuing to do work to make our community a safer place. So thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. V, and then Alan.
Yeah, great discussions tonight, as always. Thank you all.
Thanks, V. Alan, and then Dallas.
Short and sweet, V. Thank you. I also really appreciate this group. The conversation is always thoughtful. I think that the APD folks actually have to justify for one, but also think about different circumstances, and that may end up with a better policy if we make some changes. But I think the conversation is something that's really valuable. The other day when we were at council and Sean was did the presentation, which he did a very good job, by the way, to the council. One of the things that I commented on was the value of the police commission, which is that there is no other place where citizens get to talk to the EPD on a regular basis about police matters and police policy. There is no other place where a group of citizens goes word by word on policy and asks questions and gets answers and makes sure it's done right. And there is no other place where a group of citizens that are diverse get to talk with the police chief. So the police commission has a heck of a lot of value, especially in these times. 5 years ago, people said, "What the police commission?" Now everybody's like, "Police commission's where it's at." And so, thank you all for participating, and I think you serve a valuable purpose for the city of Eugene. And thank you for the indulgence. I had to finish something off for work that I had to get done. So, thank you for the indulgence at the beginning.
Thanks, Alan. Dallas and then Macy.
Good night, folks. I'm done.
Thanks, Dallas. Macy and then Jennifer.
I don't have much to say either. Good to see everyone, and I hope everyone has a good night.
Thank you very much. Jennifer and then Silver.
Thank you, everybody. And again, also thanks for all the members and for our EPD folks for all their patience and calmly and repeatedly answering our questions. It's very much appreciated.
Silver and then Chantel.
So yes, thank you for everyone for your continued effort and trying to make sure that these policies reflect the values of our community. And I'm just so tired. I think 2021 is going to be a banner year. I think we're going to try to make things improved and somebody said build back better. But I'm really looking forward to some of the work that we're currently working on here. It's good seeing you all.
Thanks, Silver. Chantel and then Ian.
Hey, thanks everyone. I also want to say thank you to Lindsay. I thought you brought up a lot of good holes in the policy, so thank you for that. Also, everybody just stay safe. Inauguration's coming up, and happy MLK Day too, since I won't see you all. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Chantel. Ian and then Bonnie.
I just wanted to say thanks to everyone. I loved how Dallas outdid V for the shortest outro message. I thought hats off. That was pretty awesome. And yeah, while there's no vaccine for a lot of the challenges that our nation faces, there is a vaccine for COVID-19. And I wanted to ask that the chief in a future chief's update talk about vaccine access and vaccine uptake by our officers. The Whitaker Community Council, one of the orgs that I'm a part of, is doing funded work by Oregon Health Authority. And we've transitioned from doing communication, well, in addition to the communication we're doing about prevention of infection and spread of COVID-19, now we're transitioning to vaccine communication. And we found that having voices in the community who talked about their own vaccine hesitancy, I didn't know much about the science, I got the vaccine and I didn't know these things, actually changes the way that people perceive these communications. So I think it's important to have different members of our community, including police officers, talk about their experience with the vaccine, just because in the pipeline of vaccine access, they're pretty high on the list. So thanks everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bonnie?
Thanks everyone. And I was just wondering, how do we bring up the domestic violence issues again in the future? That would be really great. I don't really know how to follow up on that. Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It also goes to something Lindsay was talking about future priorities. So you'll notice on the agenda, I added a box bottom right-hand side to talk about some of the things that are coming up soon. So we all have a chance to reach out to a variety of communities and ask questions and communicate about that, as well as give them forewarning about, hey, there's a commission meeting coming up you might be interested in attending. So domestic violence is not on our old work plan. It has been identified as an emergent issue, but I suspect we won't have time to fully dive into it until the next work plan. Considering that's only a couple months away, which means it's only a few meetings away. But hopefully Chief can talk a little bit more about that maybe during his next Chief's report as well. And with that, I hope everybody has a good night, and the meeting's closed.
Bye.
Bye.
See y'all later.
Yeah.